In the small industrial town of Redwood, Ohio, nobody expected much from Sean Reilly, a 45-year-old mechanic who barely kept his auto repair shop running while raising his teenage daughter alone. But when prestigious German engineers brought their revolutionary prototype engine to the local manufacturing plant and encountered a problem that stumped their most brilliant minds, wealthy plant owner Harrison Thornton made a public spectacle of ridiculing the idea that any greased local mechanic could handle such sophisticated technology. That's when Shaw stepped forward and accepted an impossible bet to fix the complex engine in just one day, unaware that his hidden 15-year secret as a former military engineering specialist would not only solve their immediate problem but uncover a catastrophic design flaw that could affect millions of lives. By the time Shaw finished, he had done more than win a bet. He had shocked an entire community into silence and forced them to confront everything they thought they knew about worth, respect, and the true meaning of expertise. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Reilly's auto repair, where Shaw stood hunched over the open hood of a rusted pickup truck. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision, adjusting a carburetor that had seen better decades. The small garage smelled of motor oil, old coffee, and the faint metallic tang that never quite left his clothes. No matter how many times they went through the wash, Shaw's daughter, Mia, emerged from the small apartment. Above the shop, her backpack slung over one shoulder, and her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. At 16, she possessed a quiet intelligence that reminded Sean painfully of her mother, who had passed away when Mia was just 7 years old. "Dad, you're going to be late for breakfast again," she called out, checking her phone for the time Shaw glanced up from the engine, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen cleaner days, just finishing up Mrs. Patterson's truck. "She needs it for work today. You always say that about every car that comes in here." Mia walked closer, observing her father's meticulous work. "You know she can't pay you until next Friday, right? She's good for it," Shaw replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned to be patient with people struggling to make ends meet. "Besides, she's got 3 kids to feed. Transportation isn't optional." Mia shook her head with the kind of exasperated affection that comes from watching a parent consistently put others before himself. "You're too soft, Dad. The bills don't care about Mrs. Patterson's situation." Shaw straightened up, feeling the familiar ache in his lower back that came from years of bending over engines. "Maybe not, but we're not in the business of making life harder for people who are already doing their best." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Shaw's assistant, Alejandro Mendez, who pulled up on his motorcycle with his usual morning enthusiasm intact despite the early hour. At 28, Alejandro possessed an infectious optimism that often served as a counterbalance to Sean's more reserved nature. "Morning, boss," Alejandro called out, removing his helmet and shaking out his thick black hair. "Morning, Mia, ready for another day of making miracles happen with duct tape and determination." "Don't forget the prayer," Shaw added with a slight smile, the first genuine expression of humor he had shown that morning. Mia gathered her things, preparing to leave for school. "I'll catch the bus at Yeppe's corner. Try not to work through lunch again, okay?" She kissed her father's forehead, leaving a small smudge where her lips had touched the grease on his skin. Shaw watched her walk away, noting how she carried herself with the confident stride of someone who had learned early that the world wouldn't hand her anything for free. "She's got her mother's determination," Alejandro observed, following Shaw's gaze. "And unfortunately, my stubborn streak," Shaw replied. "She's been talking about college applications again. Says she wants to study engineering. Smart girl. She gets that from both sides of the family." Sean returned, his attention to the pickup truck, but his movements had become more deliberate, almost contemplative. "College costs money we don't have, Alex. Even with scholarships, there are expenses. Books, housing, meal plans. The kind of money that doesn't grow on trees." Behind auto repair shops, Alejandro began organizing the day's work orders, spreading them across the small desk in the corner of the garage. "Business has been picking up lately. That's got to count for something." "Picking up isn't the same as thriving," Shaw said, closing the hood of the pickup with more force than necessary. We're treading water, not swimming to shore. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm of diagnostic work, phone calls from customers, and the steady background noise of tools against metal. Shaw had always found comfort in the predictable nature of mechanical problems. Unlike people, engines followed logical patterns. When something broke, there was always a reason. And with enough patience and knowledge, there was always a solution. Around 10 and the relative quiet of the garage was broken by the rumble of heavy trucks passing by on their way to Thornton Manufacturing, the large industrial plant that dominated the eastern edge of Redwood. The plant had been the economic backbone of the town for over 30 years, providing employment for nearly half the local population, either directly or through support services. Lot more traffic than usual. Heading to Thornton's, Alejandro commented, looking up from the transmission he was rebuilding. Shaw wiped his hands and walked to the garage's open bay door. Watching the convoy of vehicles disappear around the bend, heard Yeppe talking yesterday about some kind of special project, foreign engineers or something. Like that must be important to bring in outside help. Harrison Thornton doesn't usually like admitting his people can't handle something. The mention of Harrison Thornton's name brought a slight tension to Shaw's jaw. The plant owner was well known throughout Redwood for his condescending attitude toward anyone who worked with their hands rather than pushing papers from behind a desk. Shaw had encountered Thornton on several occasions, usually when the wealthy man's luxury vehicles needed service that his regular dealership couldn't provide quickly enough. Man thinks money makes him smarter than everyone else, Shaw said, returning to his work on a brake system that needed complete replacement. Easy for him to think that when he inherited everything from his father. Alejandro replied, never had to build something from nothing. The morning continued with steady work, but Shaw found his attention occasionally drifting to the unusual activity at the manufacturing plant. Redwood was a small enough town that any disruption to normal routines became a topic of conversation, and the arrival of foreign engineers represented the kind of change that people would discuss for weeks. Just before noon, Yeppe Lombardi appeared in the garage doorway carrying a paper bag that undoubtedly contained lunch from his diner. At 48, Joseph had the robust build of someone who believed deeply in the food he served, and his presence always brought with it the aroma of fresh bread and simmering sauces. Brought you guys some real food, Yeppe announced, setting the bag on Shaw's workbench. Can't have the town's best mechanic wasting away on vending machine coffee and determination. You don't have to keep feeding us. Yeppe Shaw protested, though. His stomach betrayed him with an audible rumble. My wife would disown me if I let good people go hungry when I can do something about it. Joseph's voice carried the warm authority of someone who had appointed himself the unofficial caretaker of half the town. Besides, I need to talk to you about something. Shaw and Alejandro gathered around the workbench as Yeppe unpacked sandwiches, soup, and coffee that was significantly better than anything they could have made themselves. You hear about what's happening over at Thornton's? Yeppe asked, settling into the conversation with the air of someone who had been waiting all morning to share important news. Saw the trucks heading that way, Shaw replied between bites of what might have been the best sandwich he had eaten. All week, German engineering team, Yeppe explained, clearly pleased to be the bearer of inside information. Brought some kind of prototype engine for testing. Word is it's supposed to revolutionize manufacturing or something like that. Alejandro looked up with interest. What kind of engine? That's where it gets interesting. Yeppe continued, lowering his voice despite the fact that they were alone in the garage. My cousin Maria works in the office over there. Says the Germans have been working on this thing for 3 days straight and they can't get it to run properly. Shaw felt a familiar stirring of curiosity, the same feeling that had drawn him to mechanical puzzles since childhood. What's the problem? Nobody knows for sure. But Maria says they've had teams of engineers looking at it around the clock. Thornton's getting more frustrated by the hour because he's got company executives flying in next week to see a demonstration. The implications weren't lost on Shaw Thornton. Manufacturing's reputation and, by extension, the economic stability of Redwood depended heavily on maintaining relationships with major industrial clients. A failed demonstration could have consequences that rippled through the entire community. Sounds like they need to swallow their pride and bring in some fresh eyes, Alejandro suggested. Yeppe nodded emphatically. That's exactly what I told Maria. Sometimes the best solutions come from people who think differently about problems. Shaw finished his sandwich in thoughtful silence. Throughout his career as a mechanic, he had encountered countless situations where expensive specialists had overlooked simple solutions. Pride and assumptions often created blind spots that prevented people from seeing what was right in front of them. Of course, Thornton would never admit that anyone in this town could help with something his fancy engineers can't figure out, Jeppe added with evident frustration. The statement hung in the air like a challenge touching on years of accumulated resentment toward the class divisions that defined much of Redwood's social structure. Shaw understood that feeling intimately, having experienced Thornton's condescension firsthand during their previous encounters. As the afternoon progressed and Juspe returned to his diner, Shaw found himself thinking about the engine problem at the manufacturing plant. Despite his better judgment, he was intrigued by the technical challenge it represented. There was something appealing about the idea of a puzzle that had stumped multiple teams of experts. By closing time, Shaw had made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow he would find a way to see this engine for himself, regardless of Harrison Thornton's opinions about small-town mechanics. If there was one thing Shaw had learned during his years of fixing the unfixable, it was that expertise came in many forms, and sometimes the most important knowledge was hidden in unexpected places. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that carried hints of the coming winter. Shaw stood outside Thornton Manufacturing's main gate, studying the imposing brick facade that had dominated Redwood skyline for 3 decades. The early hour meant most employees hadn't yet arrived, giving him time to observe the unusual activity. Without drawing attention to himself, 3 rental trucks sat in the visitor parking area, their license plates indicating they had traveled from Detroit near the main entrance. Shaw could see equipment being wheeled in on dollies, though the distance made it impossible to identify specific components. What struck him most was the deliberate, methodical pace of the work, suggesting precision rather than urgency. "Excuse me, are you lost?" Shaw turned to find a security guard approaching, his uniform crisp and his expression professionally suspicious. The name tag read Williams, and his tone carried the polite authority of someone accustomed to redirecting curiosity seekers. "Just heading to the parts department," Shaw replied, producing a work order from his jacket pocket. "Need to pick up some hydraulic seals for the loading dock equipment. Jeppe Lombardi called it in yesterday." The guard examined the paperwork with the thoroughness of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. Shaw had learned long ago that confidence and legitimate-sounding details could open doors that direct requests might not. "Parts department doesn't open until 8. Williams said, handing back the work order. "You can wait in the lobby if you want." Shaw nodded his appreciation and made his way toward the main building, noting how the security guard's attention had already shifted to other matters. Inside the lobby, he positioned himself near the large windows that provided a view of the manufacturing floor, ostensibly reading a trade magazine, while actually observing the activity around what appeared to be a specially designated work area. The engine dominated the space like a metallic sculpture, its complexity immediately apparent even from a distance. Shaw counted at least 4 people working around it, their movements suggesting both familiarity and frustration. The machine itself defied easy categorization, incorporating elements that reminded him of marine diesel engines, aircraft power plants, and industrial generators without being exactly any of those things. "Impressive, isn't it?" The voice belonged to a woman in her late 30s, dressed in practical work clothes that somehow managed to look both professional and functional. Her accent carried European inflections, and her direct gaze suggested someone accustomed to being the smartest person in most rooms. "Dr. Valentina Rossi," she said, extending her hand. "I noticed you studying our project with considerable interest." Shaw introduced himself, surprised by the firmness of her handshake and the calluses that indicated hands-on work rather than purely theoretical knowledge. "Sean Reilly. I run the auto repair shop downtown, just waiting for the parts department to open." "Auto repair," Dr. Rossi repeated thoughtfully. "You work on engines every day. Then what's your assessment of our machine?" The question caught Shaw off guard. "Both," for its directness and the genuine curiosity behind it. Most engineers he had encountered maintained careful boundaries between their expertise and the practical knowledge of mechanics. Hard to say from here, Shaw replied carefully. But the exhaust configuration suggests you're dealing with combustion efficiency issues. The way your team keeps returning to the same components tells me you've ruled out the obvious problems. Dr. Rossi's eyebrows rose slightly. That's remarkably perceptive for someone observing from across a lobby. Would you like a closer look before Shaw could respond? The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Harrison Thornton, whose expensive suit and purposeful stride announced his presence before he spoke. At 55, Thornton carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never experienced significant professional failure. Dr. Rossi, I trust you have good news about resolving our technical difficulties. Thornton said, his tone suggesting that anything other than complete success would be personally disappointing. We're making progress, Mr. Thornton, Dr. Rossi replied diplomatically. I was just discussing some observations with Mr. Reilly here. Thornton's gaze shifted to Shaw with the kind of dismissive evaluation reserved for people he considered beneath notice. I'm sure Mr. Reilly has many opinions about engines, but this isn't exactly carburetor repair work. The condescension in Thornton's voice was unmistakable, carrying years of accumulated assumptions about the intelligence and capabilities of working-class people. Shaw felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with being publicly diminished but kept his expression neutral. Actually, Dr. Rossi interjected, Mr. Reilly made some interesting observations about our combustion efficiency challenges. Sometimes fresh perspectives can illuminate problems that familiarity obscures. Thornton's laugh held no warmth. Dr. Rossi, I appreciate your diplomatic nature, but let's be realistic. This engine represents years of advanced engineering and millions of dollars in development. The notion that a local mechanic could contribute meaningful insights is frankly absurd. Shaw watched the interaction with growing anger, not just at the personal slight, but at the broader dismissal. It represented Thornton's attitude embodied everything wrong with the rigid class structures that kept talented people trapped in narrow categories. Perhaps Mr. Reilly could take a quick look. Dr. Rossi suggested, an additional perspective costs nothing, and we've exhausted most conventional approaches. Absolutely not, Thornton replied firmly. I will not have unqualified personnel near sensitive equipment. The liability alone would be staggering, never mind the potential for damage or industrial espionage. The accusation of potential espionage struck Shaw as particularly offensive, implying criminal intent based solely on his economic status. He found himself speaking before prudent caution could intervene. Industrial espionage. Sean's voice carried controlled indignation. Mr. Thornton, I have been fixing engines in this town for 15 years. My reputation is built on solving problems, not creating them. Thornton's expression hardened. Your reputation, Mr. Reilly, is built on changing oil and replacing fan belts. This engine incorporates advanced materials and precision engineering that requires specialized knowledge you simply don't possess. Dr. Rossi looked between the two men with growing interest, as if witnessing a confrontation that revealed more than either participant intended. Her scientific curiosity seemed piqued by the dynamics as much as the technical challenges. What if we made it interesting? Shaw heard himself saying, surprising himself with the words, a simple wager. Give me 1 day with that engine and I'll either fix your problem or publicly admit that you're right about my limitations. The lobby fell silent except for the distant sounds of machinery from the manufacturing floor. Thornton stared at Shaw with the expression of someone who couldn't quite believe what he had heard. You're proposing to bet that you can solve in 1 day what a team of specialists hasn't resolved in 3 days? Thornton's voice carried incredulous amusement. That's exactly what I'm proposing, Shaw replied, his commitment growing stronger with each word. 1 day complete access to the engine and your team can observe everything I do. Dr. Rossi stepped closer, her scientific interest clearly engaged. What would be the terms of this wager? Shaw considered the question, aware that he was committing to something that could either vindicate his abilities or humiliate him in front of the entire community. If I fail, I'll take out a full-page ad in the Redwood Herald, acknowledging that Harrison Thornton was right about my limitations. If I succeed, he does the same, acknowledging that expertise comes In many forms, Thornton's expression shifted from amusement to calculation. The proposal offered him an opportunity to publicly demonstrate his long-held beliefs about class and capability with minimal risk and maximum potential embarrassment for someone who had dared to challenge his authority. One day, Thornton repeated slowly, 8 hours standard working time, complete documentation of everything you do with my engineers observing and recording your methods. Agreed, Shaw said, extending his hand. Thornton shook it with the confidence of someone accepting easy victory. Dr. Rossi can explain the technical specifications. You'll begin tomorrow morning at 8 hours sharp. As Thornton walked away, clearly pleased with the arrangement, Dr. Rossi remained, behind with an expression that mixed professional curiosity with personal concern. Mr. Reilly, I hope you understand what you've just committed to, she said quietly. This engine has defeated some of the most talented engineers in Europe. The combustion dynamics involve pressure ratios and fuel injection timing that require precise calculation. Shaw nodded, appreciating her concern while feeling the weight of his decisions settling over him. Dr. Rossi, I've spent my entire adult life solving problems that other people said couldn't be solved. Sometimes the best solutions come from approaching familiar problems with unfamiliar methods. What makes you so confident? She asked. The question touched on memories. Shaw rarely discussed experiences from another life that seemed increasingly distant from his current circumstances. Let's just say, I have some relevant experience that might surprise you. Dr. Rossi studied his face with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading technical data and human behavior with equal precision. Very well. 8 tomorrow morning, I'll brief you on the technical specifications and the problems we've encountered. Shaw left Thornton Manufacturing with a mixture of excitement and apprehension coursing through his system. The walk back to his shop provided time to consider the magnitude of what he had just committed to, and the potential consequences if his confidence proved misplaced. Alejandro was already at work when Shaw arrived, rebuilding a transmission with the methodical patience that made him an excellent mechanic, despite his youth. He looked up as Shaw entered, immediately sensing something different in his employer's demeanor. Boss, you look like someone who just made either a really good decision or a really terrible one, Alejandro observed. Sean hung his jacket on the hook by the door and began organizing his tools with unusual deliberation. I just bet Harrison Thornton that I can fix his German engine problem in one day. Alejandro stopped working entirely, his wrench suspended in midair. You did what you heard me correctly. Shaw's voice carried a mixture of determination and uncertainty that Alejandro had never heard before. Shaw, that's insane. You don't even know. What kind of engine it is? It's a prototype designed for high-efficiency manufacturing applications, Shaw replied, realizing he had absorbed more information during his brief observation than he had initially recognized. Advanced combustion dynamics, precision fuel injection, probably incorporating some form of variable compression ratio. Alejandro stared at his boss with growing amazement. How do you know all that from just looking at it? The question required an answer that Shaw wasn't ready to provide. Completely, his past contained knowledge and experience that would surprise everyone in Redwood, including the people who thought they knew him best. Let's just say I've worked on similar systems before, Shaw said. Finally. Different applications, but the fundamental principles remained consistent. When Alejandro pressed, I've worked with you for 3 years and you've never mentioned anything like this. Shaw picked up a socket wrench and began organizing his toolbox with unnecessary precision, using the familiar routine to buy time while he decided how much a truth to share. Before I came to Redwood, he said, eventually, before Mia's mother died, I had a different career, different responsibilities. Sometimes life takes you in directions you never expected. The cryptic response only deepened Alejandro's curiosity, but something in Shaw's tone discouraged further questions. Instead, he returned to his transmission work, while processing the implications of what his boss had just revealed. So what happens tomorrow? Alejandro asked. Tomorrow, I either prove that good mechanics can solve any problem, or I learn a very expensive lesson about the dangers of pride, Shaw replied. The rest of the day passed in relative normalcy, but Shaw found his mind Continually returning to the engine at Thornton Manufacturing, memory fragments from his previous life kept surfacing. Technical knowledge he hadn't accessed in years, beginning to reorganize itself in preparation for tomorrow's challenge. Word of Shaw's bet spread through Redwood with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. By late afternoon, Josep's diner had become an unofficial headquarters for speculation, debate, and worried discussion about what many viewed as either supreme confidence or complete recklessness. Ruby McKenna sat at her usual corner booth, nursing her third cup of coffee while holding court with anyone willing to listen. At 67, she possessed the authority of someone who had witnessed enough life to offer opinions on virtually any subject that boy lost his mind. Ruby declared to the assembled crowd, "Harrison Thornton's been waiting 15 years for a chance to humiliate someone like Shaw. Now he's gone and handed it to him on a silver platter." Josipe moved between tables, refilling coffee cups and moderating conversations with the diplomatic skill of someone who had learned that successful restaurant ownership required equal parts cooking ability and community psychology. "Maybe Shaw knows something we don't," suggested Frank Morrison, the barber whose shop sat 2 doors down from the diner. "Man's been fixing impossible problems for years. Remember when the fire department's ladder truck broke down during the Miller farm? Fire, that was different." Ruby countered. "That was an emergency. And it was equipment," he understood. "This is some fancy foreign contraption that's got PhD engineers scratching their heads." Chief Foster entered the diner still wearing his uniform. After a long shift dealing with the increased traffic around Thornton Manufacturing, his presence immediately shifted the conversation's tone as his opinion carried weight throughout the community. "Evening, Chief," Yeppe called out. "Coffee make it a double?" Foster replied, settling into an empty chair at Ruby's table. "Been a long day managing curiosity seekers trying to get a look at all the commotion." "What's your take on Shaw's situation?" Frank asked directly. Foster considered the question while Joseph delivered his coffee. As a fellow veteran, he understood that some people carried knowledge and experience that wasn't immediately apparent to casual observers. "Sean Reilly's not a fool," Foster said finally. "He wouldn't risk his reputation and his daughter's future on blind arrogance. If he thinks he can handle this challenge, he's got reasons the rest of us don't understand yet." The chief's measured response carried enough authority to quiet some of the more dire predictions. Though Ruby remained unconvinced, "Raisins or not, that man's about to go up against people who've spent their entire careers studying engines," she insisted. "Pride goes before a fall, and Shaw's got more pride than sense sometimes." Meanwhile, at the auto shop, Shaw worked methodically through his evening routine, while his mind processed technical memories he hadn't accessed in years. The familiar weight of his tools felt different tonight, each implement carrying the potential to either vindicate or humiliate him in front of everyone he cared about. Alejandro had stayed late ostensibly to finish the transmission rebuild, but actually because he sensed his boss needed company during what had to be a stressful evening. Their conversation remained focused on routine matters, but underlying tension colored every exchange. "You sure you don't want to talk about tomorrow?" Alejandro asked, breaking a comfortable silence that had stretched several minutes. Shaw looked up from the engine manual he'd been studying, though his concentration had been scattered all evening. "What's to talk about? I committed to solving a problem. Tomorrow I'll either succeed or fail. It's not that simple, and you know it." Alejandro pressed. "This affects more than just your reputation. Mia's counting on you. The whole community's watching. If this goes badly, we'll deal with the consequences." Shaw interrupted, his voice carrying more edge than usual. "But it's not going badly. I know what I'm doing." The certainty in Shaw's tone surprised both men, revealing confidence that seemed to draw from sources neither had previously discussed. Alejandro recognized that his boss was operating from knowledge and experience that extended far beyond their shared work in the shop. "Where does that confidence come from?" Alejandro asked quietly. "Because 3 days ago you'd never seen that engine. Now you're betting everything on your ability to fix it." Shaw closed the manual and leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of secrets he had carried for 15 years. The approaching deadline forced him to confront truths he had successfully avoided discussing with anyone in Redwood. "Before I came, Here I worked on systems that make that prototype look simple, Shaw said eventually. Different environment, different pressures, but the fundamental principles remain constant. Combustion is combustion. Mechanical stress is mechanical stress. The applications change, but physics doesn't. What kind of systems? Alejandro pressed, sensing that his boss was finally willing to reveal information he had kept private. Shaw stood and walked to the window overlooking Main Street, watching the evening light fade across buildings that had become home despite his never intending to stay in Redwood permanently. Military applications, Shaw said finally, engines for equipment that had to work perfectly, under conditions where failure meant people died. No room for error, no second chances, no excuses. The revelation recontextualized everything. Alejandro thought he knew about his boss. Sean's methodical approach to problem-solving, his ability to diagnose complex issues quickly, his calm under pressure, suddenly made sense within a different framework. How long? Alejandro asked. 12 years active duty, specialized in power plant design and battlefield repair. By the time I left, I was designing propulsion systems for equipment I can't discuss and probably shouldn't remember. Why did you leave? Sean's expression darkened, touching on memories that still carried emotional weight despite the passage of time. Personal reasons. Family tragedy. Sometimes life forces you to choose between career and conscience. Before Alejandro could ask follow-up questions, the shop door opened to admit Mia, who had finished her homework and come downstairs to check on her father's preparations for tomorrow's challenge. Dad, there are people gathered outside Juice talking about you, she announced, settling into the chair Alejandro had vacated. Mrs. McKenna thinks you've lost your mind. Shaw smiled despite his tension, appreciating his daughter's direct approach to difficult subjects. Mrs. McKenna thinks everyone under 70 has lost their mind. What do you think? Mia studied her father's face with the intensity she brought to complex mathematics problems, looking for clues about his emotional state and level of preparation. I think you wouldn't risk our future on something you weren't confident about, she said finally. But I also think you're not telling me everything about why you're so confident. The observation demonstrated the perceptiveness that made Mia an exceptional student and occasionally uncomfortable. Daughter Shaw had always known she would eventually begin asking questions about his past that required more complete answers than he had been prepared to provide. What if I told you that fixing engines used to be my specialty before you were born? Shaw asked carefully. I'd ask what kind of engines and why you never mentioned it before and what happened to make you stop. Mia replied without hesitation. Shaw exchanged glances with Alejandro, recognizing that his daughter deserved honest answers about the choices that had shaped their lives. I used to design and repair propulsion systems for military equipment, Shaw explained, sophisticated machines that required perfect performance under extreme conditions. Your mother's illness forced me to choose between that career and being present for our family. Mia absorbed this information with the careful consideration she applied to all new data processing implications and connections with mathematical precision. So, tomorrow isn't really about proving anything to Harrison Thornton, she concluded. It's about proving something to yourself. The insight struck closer to truth than Shaw had been willing to acknowledge even privately. Tomorrow's challenge represented more than a simple bet or community confrontation. It offered an opportunity to reconnect with abilities and knowledge he had deliberately set aside for 15 years. Maybe, Shaw admitted, but it's also about proving that expertise comes in many forms, and that respect should be based on capability rather than assumptions. What happens if you fail? Mia asked directly. Shaw considered the question seriously, acknowledging fears he had been avoiding all day. If I fail, we'll face some embarrassment and continue working twice as hard to pay for your college education. If I succeed, maybe, we'll have some new opportunities. Those aren't the only possibilities, Mia pointed out. Success might bring attention you're not prepared for. If you're as good as you think you are, other people will notice. The observation revealed another dimension of tomorrow's challenge that Shaw hadn't fully considered. Success would inevitably lead to questions about his background and capabilities, potentially forcing him to confront aspects of his past he had successfully avoided discussing one problem at a time, Shaw said, reaching over to squeeze his daughter's hand. Tomorrow, I focus on solving an engineering puzzle. Everything else can wait. As evening settled over Redwood, Shaw spent his final preparation, time reviewing technical principles he hadn't consciously accessed in years. The knowledge remained intact, waiting in memory like tools carefully stored and maintained. Despite disuse, Alejandro eventually departed with promises to arrive early tomorrow for moral support, while Mia headed upstairs to complete reading assignments that seemed trivial compared to her father's approaching challenge. Alone in his shop, Shaw allowed himself to remember details from his former life that he had deliberately buried. The satisfaction of solving complex problems under pressure, the respect accorded to genuine expertise, the confidence that came from knowing your abilities matched any challenge tomorrow would determine whether 15 years of small-town life had dulled those skills or simply kept them in reserve for when they were needed. Most either way, he had committed to finding out in front of an audience that included everyone who mattered to him. The stakes couldn't be higher, but for the first time since making the bet, Shaw felt genuinely prepared for what morning would bring. His hands still remembered the feel of precision work, and his mind still carried the systematic approach that had once made him one of the military's most trusted engineering specialists. Harrison Thornton had inadvertently challenged the wrong person, though he wouldn't discover that mistake until it was too late to avoid the consequences. Tomorrow would prove that expertise, like respect, couldn't be measured by economic status or social position. Shaw locked the shop and headed upstairs, confident that tomorrow would change everything for both himself and the community that had become his unexpected home. Dawn broke gray and cold over Redwood. With frost covering the windshields of cars parked along Main Street, Shaw arrived at his shop before sunrise, moving through his morning routine with the deliberate calm of someone who had learned to manage pre-mission nerves through established rituals. He selected tools with careful consideration, choosing instruments that offered precision and reliability over convenience. Each wrench gauge and diagnostic device went into his leather tool roll according to a system he had developed during years of fieldwork where organization could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Alejandro appeared at 7:15, carrying coffee and wearing an expression that mixed excitement with apprehension. Brought breakfast, he announced, producing pastries from Joseph's along with the coffee. Figured you might not have much appetite, but you need fuel. Shaw accepted the coffee gratefully, though food held little appeal despite his empty stomach. Any word from the diner about how many people are planning to show up? Yeppe says half the town's going to find excuses to drive past Thornton's this morning. Alejandro replied Chief Foster's already stationed a patrol car near the main gate to manage traffic. The knowledge that his performance would have an audience beyond the immediate participants added weight to Shaw's shoulders, but also reinforced his determination to succeed. Redwood deserved to see that working people possessed capabilities their employers rarely acknowledged or respected. At 7:45, Shaw locked his shop and walked toward Thornton Manufacturing with his tool roll slung over his shoulder. The morning air carried the industrial sounds of a factory preparing for another day, mixed with unusual activity around the engineering facility where today's challenge would unfold. A small crowd had already gathered near the public parking area, including several familiar faces from Joseph's diner and local businesses. Shaw recognized the mixture of curiosity and concern in their expressions, understanding that his performance would reflect on the entire working community. Dr. Rossi met him at the main entrance dressed in practical work clothes and carrying a clipboard thick with technical documentation. Sir, manner suggested professional anticipation rather than the skepticism he had encountered from other company representatives. Good morning, Mr. Reilly, she said, extending her hand. Are you ready to examine the engine? Properly ready as I'll ever be, Shaw replied, appreciating the directness of her approach. They walked through corridors that smelled of industrial lubricants and ozone, passing offices where employees watched through windows with obvious interest in the morning's proceedings. Shaw noted the mixture of expressions ranging from supportive curiosity to barely concealed amusement at what many clearly viewed as an exercise in futility. The engineering bay had been prepared like an operating theater with additional lighting focused on the prototype engine and documentation stations positioned for optimal observation. 3 members of the German engineering team stood near diagnostic equipment, their body language suggesting professional weariness, mixed with genuine curiosity. About unconventional approaches, Harrison Thornton occupied a chair positioned to provide clear sightlines, while maintaining appropriate distance from the actual work area. His expression conveyed the confidence of someone anticipating vindication. Of long-held beliefs about expertise and social hierarchy, Mr. Reilly Dr. Rossi began formally. Let me introduce the engineering team. Klaus Weber, our senior mechanical engineer, Ingrid Hoffman, electronics specialist, Stefan Braun, quality control supervisor. Each German engineer shook Shaw's hand with professional courtesy, though their reserved manner indicated skepticism about his ability to contribute meaningful solutions. Klaus Weber's grip lingered slightly longer, suggesting evaluation of Shaw's physical condition and manual dexterity. Dr. Rossi briefed us on your background, Weber said in careful English. Auto repair, yes. This engine incorporates systems that may be unfamiliar to automotive applications. Shaw nodded acknowledgement while studying the machine that dominated the workspace. Up close, its complexity became even more apparent, incorporating elements from multiple engineering disciplines in ways that suggested innovative approaches to familiar problems. Before I begin, Shaw said, could you walk me through the specific symptoms you've encountered? Dr. Rossi consulted her clipboard, organizing information that represented 3 days of systematic troubleshooting. The engine starts normally and runs smoothly at idle speeds. However, under load conditions, we experience severe vibration, followed by automatic shutdown. Our diagnostics indicate pressure anomalies in the combustion chambers, but we haven't identified the root cause, Shaw circled. The engine slowly observing details that diagnostic equipment might miss while his mind processed the described symptoms against knowledge drawn from previous experience with similar power plants. What's the fuel injection timing, he asked. Precisely. Calibrated according to design specifications, Ingrid Hoffman replied. We've verified timing accuracy within thousandths of a second, compression ratios consistent across all cylinders. Stefan Braun added. We've conducted complete pressure testing multiple times. Shaw knelt beside the engine block, running his hands along surfaces while listening to the subtle sounds of idling operation. His fingers detected vibrations that instruments might quantify but not necessarily interpret correctly. Dr. Rossi, could you bring the engine up to approximately 60% load capacity? Shaw requested. That will trigger the shutdown sequence, Weber warned. We've attempted this test repeatedly. I understand, Shaw replied, but I need to hear what happens immediately before the shutdown. Dr. Rossi activated the loading controls and the engine's note deepened as demand increased. Shaw positioned himself near the exhaust manifold, closing his eyes to better focus on auditory cues that might reveal information visual inspection had missed. The vibration began as a subtle tremor building rapidly toward the threshold where safety systems would intervene, but in the seconds before automatic shutdown, Shaw detected an irregular harmonic frequency that suggested resonance problems, rather than mechanical failure. Stop, he called out, and Dr. Rossi immediately reduced the load. Shaw stood. Slowly, his expression thoughtful as he processed observations that challenged some of the assumptions underlying previous diagnostic efforts. The problem isn't in your combustion timing or pressure ratios, he announced. You're dealing with harmonic resonance in the exhaust system that's creating back pressure fluctuations. The German engineers exchanged glances that mixed skepticism with interest. Harmonic resonance represented a sophisticated engineering concept that auto mechanics rarely encountered, yet Shaw had identified it within minutes of hands-on examination. Explain your reasoning, Weber requested, his tone suggesting professional curiosity rather than dismissive challenge. Shaw approached the exhaust manifold, pointing to specific components while organizing his explanation in terms that would demonstrate technical knowledge without revealing the full extent of his background. Under load conditions, exhaust gas velocity creates standing wave patterns in your manifold design. Shaw explained the resonance frequency coincides with your optimal power output range, causing pressure fluctuations that your engine management system interprets as combustion anomalies. Ingrid Hoffman pulled up diagnostic data on her tablet, scanning pressure readings while considering Shaw's analysis. That would explain the timing of our shutdown events, she admitted. But our exhaust system design underwent extensive computer modeling. Computer models assume ideal conditions. Shaw replied. Real-world applications introduce variables that theoretical calculations might miss manufacturing. Tolerances, material properties, ambient conditions all affect actual performance. Harrison Thornton had been listening with growing unease, recognizing that Shaw's analysis demonstrated knowledge that contradicted his assumptions about local capabilities. The possibility that a small-town mechanic might succeed where expensive specialists had failed threatened fundamental beliefs about intelligence and social order. Theoretical discussion is interesting, Thornton interjected. But can you actually fix the problem? Shaw studied the exhaust manifold configuration, mental calculations drawing on knowledge of fluid dynamics and acoustic engineering that he hadn't consciously accessed in years. The solution required modification of existing components, rather than complete replacement, making it achievable within the daytime constraints. Yes, Shaw said simply. But I'll need to modify your exhaust gas flow patterns. That means cutting and welding work on the manifold assembly. Dr. Rossi looked toward Thornton for authorization, understanding that permanent modifications to prototype equipment required approval from the project's financial sponsors. This is exactly what I expected, Thornton declared. Destructive modifications based on hunches, rather than systematic analysis, Dr. Rossi. I cannot authorize damage to equipment worth more than this man's annual income. The statement hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone present to confront the underlying assumptions about risk, expertise, and trust that defined the entire situation. Shaw felt the familiar anger that came with being dismissed based on economic status, rather than demonstrated knowledge, but channeled that energy into professional determination, rather than emotional reaction. Mr. Thornton, Shaw said calmly, I'm not proposing to damage anything. I'm suggesting surgical modifications that will eliminate the resonance problem, while maintaining all other performance characteristics. The changes are reversible. If my analysis proves incorrect and if you're wrong, Thornton demanded, if your modifications destroy equipment that represents years of development work, then I accept full responsibility for the consequences, Shaw replied. But I'm not wrong. Harmonic resonance follows predictable patterns, and the solution I'm proposing addresses the root cause rather than symptoms. Dr. Rossi found herself in the position of mediating between financial responsibility and scientific curiosity. Aware that Shaw's analysis offered the first promising diagnostic direction they had encountered, what exactly would these modifications involve? She asked. Shaw approached the exhaust manifold with his measuring tools, marking specific locations where strategic changes would alter gas flow patterns without compromising structural integrity. 3 precision cuts to modify branch lengths, followed by welding of expansion chambers at calculated intervals. Shaw explained, the work requires accuracy, but it's well within standard fabrication capabilities. The German engineers huddled briefly, discussing Shaw's proposal in rapid German before Weber addressed the group in English. The theoretical basis is sound. Weber admitted exhaust tuning affects engine performance in ways our modeling might not have fully captured, but the risk remains substantial. Harrison Thornton's expression revealed internal conflict between his desire to see Shaw fail and his responsibility to project stakeholders who expected results regardless of source. 1 hour. Thornton said finally, you have 1 hour to demonstrate that your modifications produce measurable improvement. If performance doesn't improve significantly, we stop immediately. Shaw nodded acceptance of the terms while mentally organizing the sequence of modifications required to achieve success within the specified time frame. His hands already knew the feel of the work ahead. Muscle memory from years of precision fabrication beginning to reassert itself. I'll need welding equipment and cutting tools, Shaw said, rolling up his sleeves to reveal forearms marked by years of skilled manual labor. Dr. Rossi signaled to plant personnel, who began wheeling equipment into position, while the German engineers prepared to document every step of Sean's approach. Outside, word had spread that something significant was happening, and the crowd near the parking area had grown to include most of Redwood's business community. Success or failure would ripple through every conversation in town for months to come. Shaw picked up his first tool and approached the engine ready to prove that expertise transcended social boundaries and that practical knowledge could solve problems that theoretical analysis had missed. Shaw adjusted the welding helmet with practiced efficiency, his movements carrying the precision of someone who had performed similar work under far more demanding conditions than a factory. Observation room. The acetylene torch ignited with a controlled blue flame that he fine-tuned with subtle adjustments that spoke to years of experience with precision metal work. The first cut required removing a section of exhaust pipe at exactly the point where gas velocity created maximum turbulence. Sean's hands moved steadily along the marked line, the cutting torch separating metal with surgical accuracy, while sparks fell in controlled patterns that indicated complete mastery of the tool. Klaus Fieber leaned closer, observing the cutting technique with growing professional interest. "Very precise work," he murmured to Dr. Rossi. "This is not typical auto repair methodology." Shaw completed the first cut and immediately began measuring. The remove section against calculations he had sketched on a piece of paper, pulled from his tool roll. The mathematical precision of his approach surprised the German engineers who had expected trial and error methods rather than systematic analysis. Mr. Reilly, Ingrid Hoffman called out, "How did you calculate the optimal cut length?" Esha looked up from his measurements, recognizing that his answer would reveal knowledge that extended far beyond automotive applications. "Exhaust gas velocity creates standing waves with wavelengths determined by temperature, pressure, and pipe diameter. Cutting at quarter wavelength intervals eliminates the resonance nodes that cause back pressure fluctuations." The explanation demonstrated understanding of acoustic engineering principles that most automotive technicians never encountered, further deepening the observer's curiosity about Shaw's background and training. Stefan Brown consulted his tablet, pulling up acoustic modeling software to verify Sean's calculations. "His mathematics are correct," he announced with obvious surprise. "The quarter wavelength positioning should indeed eliminate harmonic resonance." Harrison Thornton shifted uncomfortably in his observation chair, beginning to recognize that his assumptions about Shaw's capabilities might prove embarrassingly incorrect. The mechanic's systematic approach and technical knowledge suggested expertise that didn't fit comfortable categories about working-class limitations. Shaw began fabricating the first expansion chamber, bending metal with tools that seemed to respond to his intentions rather than requiring conscious guidance. His movements demonstrated the muscle memory that came from years of precision work, each operation flowing seamlessly into the next without wasted motion or hesitation. The welding work required joining dissimilar metals under conditions that demanded perfect heat control to avoid warping or contamination. Shaw approached the task with methodical preparation, cleaning surfaces and selecting filler materials with care that indicated understanding of metallurgical principles. When he struck the welding arc, the resulting bead demonstrated professional quality that impressed even the skeptical observers. Each pass of the electrode created uniform penetration and smooth surface finish that spoke to thousands of hours of practice under demanding conditions. "Where did you learn to weld like that?" Dr. Rossi asked during a brief pause. While Shaw prepared the next joint, Shaw lifted his helmet, revealing intense concentration mixed with satisfaction that came from rediscovering abilities. He had deliberately set aside military training includes fabrication work under field conditions. When equipment breaks in remote locations, you learn to fix it properly the first time. The casual reference to military experience provided context for Shaw's unusual skill set while raising additional questions about his specific background and training. Klaus Ober exchanged meaningful glances with his colleagues, recognizing that they were witnessing capabilities that transcended typical civilian automotive experience. Outside the engineering bay, word had reached the gathering crowd that something extraordinary was happening inside the plant. Giuseppe Lombardi had stationed himself near the main entrance, collecting updates from plant employees and relaying information to the growing assembly of townspeople. "Maria just came out for a smoke break," Josep reported to Chief Foster. "Says the German engineers are looking amazed at Shaw's work. Never seen anything like his welding technique." Apparently, Ruby McKenna clutched her coffee cup with nervous energy, torn between hope for Shaw's success and fear of disappointment that could affect the entire community. "That boy better know what he's doing. Whole town's reputation riding on this now." Back inside the engineering bay, Shaw completed the second expansion chamber and began positioning it according to calculations that accounted for exhaust gas temperature and flow characteristics. His placement required precision within millimeters achieved through measurement techniques that demonstrated familiarity with engineering tolerances. The German team had abandoned any pretense of casual observation, instead, documenting Sean's every movement with the intensity of researchers studying an unexpected phenomenon. Their initial skepticism had evolved into professional fascination with methods that achieved results through approaches they hadn't considered. Stefan Klaus Greiber said quietly, "Are you recording the acoustic calculations he's using?" Every measurement Stefan confirmed his methodology is completely sound, but the practical application suggests field experience. We didn't anticipate Shaw's third modification involved creating a resonance damper that required bending exhaust pipe into a precise spiral configuration. The work demanded understanding of both structural engineering and fluid dynamics, combining theoretical knowledge with practical fabrication skills. As he heated the metal for bending, Shaw's movements took on the rhythm of someone performing familiar work. The torch flame followed complex curves with steady precision, creating smooth bends without kinks or distortion that would affect gas flow patterns Ingrid Hoffman approached, with her measuring instruments checking Shaw's work against the original design specifications. The modifications maintain all original connection points, she observed. Very elegant solution that preserves system integrity. That was the point. Shaw replied, beginning the final welding sequence. Fix the problem without creating new UNs. The last welds required joining the modified exhaust system back to the original engine configuration. Work that demanded perfect alignment to prevent stress, concentrations that could cause future failures. Shaw approached these critical joints with extra care, understanding that his reputation depended on both immediate performance and long-term reliability. Harrison Thornton checked his watch with obvious tension, aware that the agreed-upon hour was approaching while Shaw continued working with unhurried precision. The plant owner found himself in the uncomfortable position of hoping for success that would validate someone he had publicly dismissed. 15 minutes remaining. Thornton announced, his voice carrying stress that indicated personal stakes. Beyond the immediate wager, Shaw completed the final weld and began cleaning his work area with the systematic approach that had characterized the entire project. Each tool returned to its designated position, work surfaces cleared of debris, safety equipment properly stored, according to protocols that suggested institutional training. Dr. Rossi examined the completed modifications with growing excitement. Recognizing that Shaw had addressed the harmonic resonance problem through elegant engineering, rather than brute force solutions, the theoretical basis is excellent. But now, we need to test actual performance. The engine sat quietly in its test frame, external appearance unchanged except for the subtle modifications to the exhaust system. The real test would come when load conditions recreated the failure modes that had frustrated 3 days of previous attempts. Klaus Fieber approached the control station, while his colleagues positioned diagnostic equipment to monitor performance parameters during the upcoming test. The tension in the room reflected recognition that success or failure would fundamentally alter perceptions about expertise and capability. Mr. Reilly, Dr. Rossi said formally, "Are you ready to demonstrate your music modifications?" Shaw nodded, removing his work gloves and stepping back from the engine with the confidence of someone who had solved the problem. "Correctly. The harmonic resonance issue has been eliminated. Your engine should now operate smoothly under full load conditions." The assembled observers took positions around the test area, each person aware that the next few minutes would determine whether Sean's reputation would be enhanced or destroyed. The German engineers prepared their instruments while Harrison Thornton gripped his chair arms with white knuckles. Outside, Josep had positioned himself where he could see through the engineering bay windows, ready to signal the waiting crowd about test results. The entire community seemed suspended in anticipation, understanding that Shaw's success or failure would reflect on everyone who had ever been dismissed based on economic status rather than capability. Shaw stepped back to a safe observation distance, his expression calm despite the enormous pressure riding on the engine's performance. Years of military experience had taught him to remain steady during moments when everything depended on technical competence and careful preparation. "Bring her up slowly," Shaw suggested to Dr. Rossi. "Let the modifications prove themselves gradually." Dr. Rossi's hand moved toward the control panel, ready to test whether a small-town mechanic had succeeded where teams of specialists had failed. The silence in the engineering bay reflected the weight of expectations that extended far beyond simple mechanical performance. Everyone present understood that they were about to witness either vindication of unconventional approaches or confirmation of established hierarchies. Shaw had staked his reputation on knowledge and skills that challenged fundamental assumptions about intelligence, expertise, and social worth. The moment of truth had arrived, carrying implications that would ripple through every subsequent conversation about respect, capability, and the hidden talents that existed in unexpected places. Success would prove that expertise transcended social boundaries, while failure would reinforce prejudices that had defined community relationships for generations. Shaw watched the control panel with steady confidence, ready to learn whether 15 years of hidden knowledge would finally receive the recognition it deserved. Dr. Rossi's finger hovered over the engine control switch, the weight of expectation making even this simple action feel momentous. Around the engineering bay, instruments hummed quietly as they prepared to record data that would either vindicate or humiliate Shaw's confident diagnosis. "Beginning load test sequence." Dr. Rossi announced, her voice carrying the formal tone of someone documenting a potentially historic moment. The engine responded smoothly, as electronic systems gradually increased demand from idle to 20% load capacity. Previously, this transition had proceeded normally, with problems emerging only as stress levels approached the range where harmonic resonance had triggered automatic shutdowns. Shaw watched the diagnostic displays with practiced eyes, noting pressure readings and temperature fluctuations that remained within acceptable parameters. His modifications had eliminated the irregular vibrations that typically preceded system failures, but the real test would come at higher load levels. 30% load. Dr. Rossi called out, advancing the controls with deliberate caution. Klaus Weber monitored acoustic sensors that had previously detected the onset of resonance problems, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement, as readings remained stable across frequency ranges that had caused difficulties throughout the previous 3 days. "Pressure variations are within design tolerances." Ingrid Hoffman reported, consulting digital readouts that showed none of the erratic fluctuations that had characterized earlier test attempts. "Exhaust back pressure is steady across all measurement and points." Shaw felt tension leaving his shoulders as the engine demonstrated smooth operation through load ranges that had previously triggered protective shutdowns. His analysis had been correct, and the modifications were performing exactly as calculated. 45% load. Dr. Rossi continued, her confidence growing with each successful increment. Stephen Brown leaned closer to his monitoring equipment, unable to believe the steady readings after days of watching the same systems fail repeatedly. "This is remarkable. We're seeing none of the harmonic disturbances that forced previous shutdowns." Harrison Thornton's expression had evolved from confident anticipation to uncomfortable recognition that his public dismissal of Shaw's capabilities was about to prove embarrassingly wrong. The plant owner found himself hoping for success that would benefit his project while simultaneously dreading the personal humiliation it represented. 60% load, Dr. Rossi announced, reaching the threshold where previous tests had invariably failed. The engine continued running smoothly, its deep rumble carrying none of the irregular harmonics that had characterized earlier problems. Shaw's modifications had completely eliminated the resonance issues, allowing the prototype to demonstrate its intended performance characteristics. Outside the engineering bay, Yeppe caught sight of the steady operation through the observation windows and immediately signaled to the waiting crowd. His enthusiastic gestures triggered excited conversation among the assembled townspeople who understood that something significant was occurring even without detailed technical knowledge. 75% load. Dr. Rossi called out, her voice now carrying excitement rather than apprehension. The German engineering team exchanged amazed glances as their instruments continued showing perfect operation across all monitored parameters. Klaus Weber began documenting Shaw's modifications with the intensity of someone recording a breakthrough that would require explanation to superiors. Incredible, Weber muttered in heavily accented English. 3 days we work on this problem and he solves it in 1 hour with simple exhaust modifications. Shaw approached the monitoring station studying readouts that confirmed his diagnosis while revealing additional information about the engine's design characteristics. As he analyzed the data patterns, something caught his attention that went beyond the immediate resonance problem. Dr. Rossi, can you hold steady at 75% while I examine the pressure? Distribution curves? Shaw requested, his tone shifting to include concern that hadn't been present moments earlier. Of course, Dr. Rossi replied, maintaining the load level. While Shaw studied diagnostic displays with growing concentration, the successful resolution of the harmonic resonance issue had revealed underlying pressure patterns that previous failures had obscured. Shaw's trained eye detected irregularities in the data that suggested problems far more serious than the exhaust tuning difficulties they had just solved. There's something else, Shaw said quietly, his voice carrying the gravity of someone who had discovered complications that extended beyond the immediate challenge. Klaus Fieber looked up from his documentation, alerted by the change in Shaw's demeanor. What do you see? Shaw pointed to pressure readings that showed subtle but concerning variations in combustion chamber dynamics. The resonance problem was masking irregular pressure spikes in cylinders 3 and 6. Now that we've eliminated the harmonic interference, I can see the real issue. Ingrid Hoffman joined them at the monitoring station, following Shaw's finger as he traced curves that revealed dangerous inconsistencies in engine performance. Those variations are within acceptable tolerances, she protested, for short-term testing. Yes, Shaw replied grimly, but under sustained operation, those pressure differentials will cause catastrophic bearing failure within several hundred hours of use. The engineering bay fell silent as the implications of Sean's observation became clear. Success in solving the immediate problem had revealed a deeper flaw that threatened the entire project, and potentially any equipment using similar design principles. Stephen Brown pulled up long-term reliability projections on his tablet, comparing Shaw's observed pressure patterns against theoretical performance models. If he's correct about bearing stress accumulation, we could face field failures that affect thousands of units. Dr. Rossi slowly reduced the engine load while processing the significance of Shaw's discovery. What had begun as a simple bet about mechanical competence had evolved into identification of design flaws that could prevent widespread equipment failures. How can you be certain about bearing failure patterns? Klaus Fieber asked, his tone reflecting professional respect mixed with curiosity about Sean's analytical capabilities. Sean's response required drawing on knowledge and experience that would fully reveal the extent of his background, forcing him to confront truths he had kept private for 15 years. I've seen similar pressure patterns in military power plants, Shaw said finally. Engines that performed perfectly during testing, but failed catastrophically under sustained field conditions. The bearing stress accumulation follows predictable patterns, once you know what to look for. Harrison Thornton leaned forward in his chair, beginning to understand that Shaw's success had implications far beyond winning a simple wager. The discovery of serious design flaws would require extensive revision of development timelines and manufacturing plans. Mr. Reilly, Dr. Rossi said carefully, "Are you suggesting that this entire engine design contains fundamental problems that our engineering analysis missed?" Shaw studied the pressure data with the systematic approach that had characterized his entire performance, weighing the implications of complete honesty against the comfortable anonymity he had maintained for years. "I'm suggesting that your computer modeling didn't account for real-world operating conditions that cause bearing stress accumulation," Shaw replied. "The design works perfectly under laboratory conditions, but will fail under sustained load cycles that field applications require." The German engineers huddled together, discussing Shaw's analysis in rapid German while consulting technical documentation and performance projections. Their animated conversation suggested recognition that his observations addressed concerns they had encountered but not fully understood outside the engineering bay. The crowd had grown to include most of Redwood's business community, drawn by reports that something extraordinary was happening at the manufacturing plant. Yeppe maintained his position near the observation windows, ready to relay developments into the eager assembly engines running smooth as silk. Josiep reported to Ruby McKenna and Chief Foster. But looks like they're having some kind of serious discussion in there. Sean's pointing at computer screens, and the German fellows are looking mighty concerned. Inside the bay, Klaus Weber returned from the engineering conference with an expression that mixed professional admiration with personal concern about project implications. Your analysis is correct, Weber announced. Formally, the bearing stress patterns you've identified match problems we encountered during extended testing in Germany, but we couldn't determine the root cause. Shaw nodded gravely, understanding that his success in solving the immediate challenge had revealed responsibilities that extended far beyond winning a bet or proving personal capabilities. How many units are planned for production? Shaw asked. Initial manufacturing run calls for 5 source units, Dr. Rossi replied. But if field testing proves successful, we anticipate demand for hundreds of thousands of engines over the next decade. The numbers carried sobering implications about the scope of potential failures and the human consequences of releasing flawed equipment into widespread use. Shaw found himself facing decisions about expertise and responsibility that he had successfully avoided. For 15 years, Dr. Rossi Shaw said formally, I believe I can design modifications that will eliminate the bearing stress problems, but it will require complete revision of the combustion chamber geometry and fuel injection timing. Harrison Thornton stood abruptly, recognizing that Shaw's discoveries had transformed a simple demonstration into a major engineering consultation that could affect millions of dollars in development costs and production schedules. Mr. Reilly, Thornton said slowly, it appears that your expertise extends considerably beyond anything I had anticipated. Perhaps we should discuss compensation arrangements for additional consulting work. The offer represented complete reversal of Thornton's previous attitude, acknowledging that social prejudices had blinded him to capabilities that could prove invaluable to his company's success. Shaw looked around the engineering bay, seeing respect in the faces of people who had initially dismissed him, based on economic status rather than demonstrated knowledge. The moment represented vindication of everything he had sacrificed to maintain his principles and protect his family. Mr. Thornton, Shaw replied calmly, we can discuss business arrangements after I've had time to consider what's best for my family and my community. But first, we need to address the immediate safety implications of your current design. The response demonstrated that success hadn't changed Shaw's priorities or his commitment to principles that transcended personal advancement. His primary concern remained preventing failures that could affect innocent people rather than capitalizing on newfound recognition. Dr. Rossi began shutting down the test equipment while Klaus Weber prepared preliminary reports about Shaw's discoveries for transmission to company headquarters in Germany. The day events would require extensive explanation and complete revision of development timelines. Outside, Yeppe finally signaled to the waiting crowd that the test had concluded successfully, triggering celebration among townspeople who understood that Shaw's achievement reflected positively on the entire working community. But inside the engineering bay, Shaw contemplated responsibilities that extended far beyond personal vindication or community pride. His expertise had uncovered problems that required solutions, and his conscience wouldn't allow him to walk away from consequences that could affect thousands of people. The engineering bay had transformed into an impromptu conference room as the implications of Sean's discoveries rippled through the assembled group. Klaus Weber finished a lengthy phone conversation with company headquarters in Germany, his expression grave as he relayed the scope of design revisions that would be required. Munchen wants complete documentation of the bearing stress analysis, Weber announced to Dr. Rossi. They're convening an emergency engineering review to assess the impact on the entire product line. Shaw gathered his tools with methodical precision, understanding that his morning's work had evolved far beyond a simple wager into a situation with international consequences. The satisfaction of proving his capabilities was tempered by recognition that expertise brought responsibilities he had spent 15 years trying to avoid. Harrison Thornton approached with the careful demeanor of someone attempting to salvage business relationships after publicly misjudging a crucial situation. Mr. Reilly, I believe we need to discuss compensation for your consulting services. The value of your discoveries far exceeds anything a simple bet could address, Mr. Thornton Shaw replied while securing his tool roll. Before we discuss business arrangements, I need to understand exactly how many people could be affected if these design flaws aren't corrected. Dr. Rossi consulted her project documentation, calculating numbers that carried sobering implications about the scope of potential equipment failures. Beyond the immediate production run, licensing agreements cover manufacturing in 12 countries. Conservative estimates suggest 2 million engines over the next 5 years. The magnitude of potential consequences settled over Shaw like a weight he recognized from his military days, when technical decisions carried life or death implications for people, depending on equipment performance under extreme conditions. Then we have work to do, Shaw said simply. But not today. I need time to consider how this affects my family and my commitments here in Redwood. Through the observation windows, Shaw could see the crowd that had gathered to witness his confrontation with Harrison Thornton. Their faces showed excitement and pride that one of their own had succeeded against overwhelming skepticism, but they couldn't understand the complexity of obligations that success had created. Josip caught sight of Shaw through the glass and gestured enthusiastically toward the main entrance, clearly eager to escort the local hero to a celebration that would undoubtedly involve the entire downtown business community. Your town seems ready to welcome a conquering hero, Dr. Rossi observed with a smile that mixed professional admiration with personal warmth. Shaw looked toward the crowd with mixed emotions, appreciating their support while feeling the burden of expectations that extended beyond anything they could imagine. They deserved to celebrate. This community has supported me through difficult times, and they should share in whatever vindication. Today represents Klaus Fieber approached with a preliminary engineering report that would serve as the basis for international design revisions. Mr. Reilly, would you be willing to review our documentation before we transmit to headquarters? Your insights could prevent months of additional development delays. The request represented acknowledgement that Shaw's expertise was essential to resolving problems that traditional engineering approaches had missed, but it also meant accepting involvement in decisions that would affect millions of people worldwide. I'll review whatever you need. Shaw agreed, but understand that my recommendations will prioritize safety over production schedules or profit margins. Harrison Thornton's expression revealed internal struggle between business pressures and newfound respect for someone he had previously dismissed. Mr. Reilly, perhaps you could join us for lunch to discuss the scope of consulting arrangements that would be mutually beneficial. Before Shaw could respond, the engineering bay door opened to admit Mia, who had apparently convinced security personnel to allow her access to the restricted area. Her presence immediately shifted Sean's focus from international business implications to family considerations that ultimately mattered most. Dad, Mia said, approaching with excitement barely contained behind her usual composed demeanor. Giuseppe says you fixed their engine and impressed everyone. The whole town's talking about it. Shaw embraced his daughter, feeling the simple pleasure of her pride in his accomplishment, while recognizing that today's events would fundamentally change their lives in ways neither had anticipated. It was more complicated than just fixing an engine, Shaw explained. But yes, we solved their immediate problem and identified some others that need attention. Mia studied the assembled engineers and sophisticated equipment with the analytical curiosity that made her an exceptional student. These are the German specialists who couldn't figure out what you solved in one morning? Klaus Fieber stepped forward with the courtesy that came from recognizing intelligence regardless of age. Your father demonstrated knowledge and analytical capabilities. That impressed our entire team. We are honored to have worked with him. The formal acknowledgement from a senior European engineer clearly meant something to Mia, who had grown up watching her father's talents go unrecognized by people who judged capability based on economic status rather than demonstrated competence. Dad always said that good mechanics could fix anything if they understood the principles involved. Mia replied, looks like he was right. Dr. Rossi joined the conversation with genuine interest in the family dynamics that had produced some of Shaw's exceptional capabilities. Your father mentioned that you're interested in studying engineering. Today's demonstration certainly provides excellent inspiration for that career path. Shaw felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with discussions about college expenses that remained beyond their current financial reach. But today's events had potentially created opportunities that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. Engineering school requires resources we're still working to accumulate, Shaw said carefully. But today might have opened some doors that were previously closed. Harrison Thornton cleared, his throat diplomatically recognizing an opportunity to address both business needs and family considerations simultaneously. Mr. Reilly, perhaps our consulting arrangement could include provisions for educational support. Companies often invest in developing expertise that serves long-term strategic interests. The offer represented everything Shaw had hoped to provide for Mia's future, but accepting it would mean abandoning the simple life they had built in Redwood for complications that extended far beyond their small community. Outside the engineering, Bijosby had organized an impromptu reception in the plant's lobby, complete with coffee and pastries from his diner. Word had spread that Shaw's success involved more than simply winning a bet, though few people understood the full scope of implications. Chief Foster worked his way through the crowd toward the engineering bay, his expression mixing personal pride in Shaw's achievement with professional concern about managing the public attention that success had generated. Sean, Chief Foster called out as he approached. Half the county's showing up to congratulate you. Yeppy's got the whole diner crew setting up food in the lobby, and Ruby McKenna's already planning some kind of community celebration. The prospect of public recognition appealed to Shaw far less than the quiet satisfaction of solving complex problems. But he understood that today's events had significance for the entire working community that extended beyond personal preferences. Chief, I appreciate everyone's support, but this situation is more complicated than it appears, Shaw replied. There are business and safety implications that require careful consideration. Pastor Charles Bell appeared in the engineering bay doorway, having convinced security that pastoral care qualified as essential services during moments of community significance. Shaw, my friend, Pastor Bell announced warmly, the entire congregation is singing your praises today. You've proven that talent and determination can overcome any obstacle. The religious leader's presence reminded Shaw that today's events carried symbolic meaning for people who had spent years being dismissed by employers and community leaders who confused economic status with personal worth. Pastor, I appreciate the kind words, but success brings responsibilities. I'm still trying to understand, Shaw replied diplomatically. Klaus Fieber had been monitoring the growing crowd through the observation windows with fascination that mixed professional interest with cultural curiosity about American community dynamics. Dr. Rossi Weber said quietly, I have never witnessed such community investment in individual technical achievement. In Germany, engineering success is appreciated professionally, but this appears to have deeper social significance. Dr. Rossi nodded thoughtfully, recognizing that Shaw's triumph represented vindication for everyone who had ever been underestimated, based on circumstances beyond their control. Mr. Reilly's success challenges assumptions about intelligence and capability that affect entire communities. She explained today, proves that expertise exists in unexpected places, and that respect should be based on demonstrated knowledge rather than social position. Shaw looked around the engineering bay, seeing faces that reflected newfound respect mixed with excitement about possibilities that hadn't existed before this morning. The German engineers regarded him as a peer whose insights were essential to their project's success. Harrison Thornton offered business partnerships that could transform his family's future. His daughter beamed with pride that her father's abilities had finally received recognition they deserved. But beneath the satisfaction of vindication, Shaw felt the weight of decisions that would determine not only his family's future, but potentially the safety of millions of people depending on equipment that incorporated design flaws only he had identified. Mr. Thornton, Shaw said finally, I need 48 hours to consider your consulting proposal and discuss it with my family. The technical problems we've identified are serious enough to require my complete attention, but I won't make commitments without understanding all the implications. The response demonstrated that success hadn't changed Shaw's methodical approach to important decisions or his commitment to family considerations that transcended business opportunities. Of course, Thornton replied, take whatever time you need. The technical documentation will be available whenever you're ready to review it. Dr. Rossi approached with project files that contained detailed engineering specifications requiring Shaw's analysis to prevent potential equipment failures. Mr. Reilly, these documents represent 3 years of development work. Your insights could save lives while advancing engineering knowledge that benefits everyone. Shaw accepted the documentation with full understanding that reviewing it meant accepting responsibilities that would fundamentally change his life and potentially separate him from the simple existence he had built in Redwood. Outside, the celebration continued with enthusiasm that reflected years of accumulated frustration with social hierarchies that dismissed working people's capabilities today, had proven that expertise transcended economic boundaries, and the community intended to savor that vindication, regardless of whatever complications might follow. Evening settled over Redwood, with the kind of crisp October air that carried wood smoke from chimneys, and the distant sounds of a community processing extraordinary events. Shaw sat at his kitchen table surrounded by technical documentation that represented 3 years of sophisticated engineering development, while Mia worked on calculus homework that seemed simple compared to the equations filling her father's borrowed materials. The thick folders contained detailed specifications, stress analysis reports, and manufacturing protocols written in the precise language of professional engineering. As Shaw studied, the documentation patterns emerged that confirmed his worst fears about the scope of design problems affecting the entire engine family. "Dad, you've been staring at those papers for 2 hours," Mia observed, looking up from her mathematics textbook. "Want to talk about what you're seeing?" Shaw removed his reading glasses and rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of knowledge that carried responsibilities extending far beyond their small apartment above the auto shop. "The bearing stress problems are worse than I initially thought. This isn't just one design flaw, it's a systematic issue affecting multiple engine configurations." Mia moved to the chair beside her father, studying engineering, drawings that displayed complexity she could appreciate even without technical training. How many different engines use these flawed designs? According to this documentation, at least 12 variants for different applications, Shaw replied grimly. Marine, propulsion industrial generators, construction equipment, agricultural machinery. If they proceed with current manufacturing plans, we're looking at widespread field failures within 2 to 3 years. The implications settled between them like an unwelcome guest, transforming what had begun as personal vindication into a moral obligation that neither could ignore. Sean's military background had instilled values about protecting innocent people from preventable disasters, while Mia's analytical mind immediately grasped the human consequences of remaining silent. A knock at the apartment door interrupted their conversation, followed by Alejandro's familiar voice, announcing his arrival with dinner from Josiepe's diner. The young mechanic had spent the afternoon managing curious visitors to the auto shop, while processing the revelation that his boss possessed expertise far beyond anything he had suspected. "Brought food," Alejandro announced as Mia opened the door, and about 50 congratulations from people who stopped by the shop today. "Josip says the whole county is talking about how you made those German engineers look foolish." Shaw accepted the meal gratefully while recognizing that public perception of today's events focused on personal triumph, rather than the technical complexities that actually mattered. "Alex, this situation is more complicated than people understand. What I discovered today has implications that extend far beyond winning a bet." Alejandro settled into the remaining chair, studying the technical documents with growing understanding of their significance. "These are the engine plans. You're supposed to review design specifications for an entire product line that contains potentially fatal flaws," Shaw confirmed. "The bearing stress problems will cause catastrophic failures under sustained operation, potentially affecting millions of units worldwide." The young mechanic whistled softly, beginning to comprehend why Shaw seemed more burdened than celebratory despite his morning's triumph. "So what happens now?" Esche organized the documentation into logical categories, while considering options that ranged from walking away to accepting responsibilities that would fundamentally alter their lives. "Harrison Thornton wants to hire me as a consulting engineer to fix the problems. Good salary, educational support for Mia, probably relocation to company headquarters. That sounds like everything you've wanted for our family," Mia said, carefully recognizing her father's conflicted emotions despite the apparent opportunity. "It is," Shaw admitted. But accepting means leaving Redwood, leaving people who've supported us through difficult times and taking on responsibilities. I've spent 15 years avoiding. Alejandro leaned forward with curiosity that had been building since Shaw's revelations about his military background. Boss, what exactly did you do before you came here? Because fixing engines is one thing, but today, you were talking about acoustic engineering and metallurgy like you designed this stuff yourself. The question touched on memories. Shaw rarely discussed experiences from a life that seemed increasingly distant from his current circumstances, but today's events had begun breaking down barriers he had maintained between past expertise and present anonymity. I was a propulsion systems engineer for the Army Corps of Engineers. Shaw said, finally specialized in power plant design for heavy equipment and mobile platforms. By the time I left, I was leading development teams for classified projects I probably shouldn't remember. Mia studied her father's face with the intensity she brought to complex problems, seeing pain beneath the professional accomplishments he was describing. What made you leave all that? Shaw looked toward the window overlooking Main Street, where lights from Joseph's diner illuminated, townspeople still discussing the day's extraordinary events. The contrast between his former life of international responsibilities and current focus on community needs had shaped 15 years of deliberate choices about what truly mattered. Your mother was diagnosed with cancer during my final deployment, Shaw explained quietly. Terminal aggressive, requiring immediate treatment and constant care. I had to choose between career advancement and being present for the two people who mattered. The revelation provided context for decisions that had shaped their entire lives, explaining Shaw's fierce commitment to family priorities over professional opportunities. Leandro began understanding why his boss approached every job with systematic precision while maintaining emotional distance from broader implications. So you gave up everything to take care of Mom? Mia said, her voice carrying appreciation for sacrifices she was only beginning to comprehend fully. I gave up a career to gain what actually mattered, Shaw corrected gently. Those last 2 years with your mother were worth more than any professional achievement. After she died, I wanted to build a life focused on what we could control, rather than global responsibilities I couldn't influence. The apartment fell quiet except for distant sounds of evening activity in the downtown district. Shaw's explanation had revealed the values and experiences that would ultimately guide his decision about Thornton's consulting offer, regardless of financial benefits or professional opportunities. Chief Foster's voice called from the stairway leading to their apartment, announcing his arrival with the respectful tone of someone who understood that today's events had created complexity requiring careful navigation. Show you up there? Got a few minutes for some unofficial conversation. Mia opened the door to admit the police chief, whose presence immediately shifted the atmosphere towards serious discussion about implications extending beyond family considerations. Chief, come in. Shaw offered, clearing technical documents to make room at the small table. What's on your mind? Foster accepted coffee while organizing thoughts about community dynamics and individual responsibilities that sometimes conflicted with personal preferences. Spent the afternoon managing traffic around the plant and answering questions from reporters who got wind of something significant happening. Foster began, words spreading beyond Redwood, about what you accomplished today. Shaw felt the familiar tension that came with unwanted attention, having deliberately chosen small-town anonymity over the visibility that accompanied expertise in his field. Chief, I was hoping this would remain local news, rather than attracting outside interest. Too late for that, Foster replied pragmatically. Kozip has been telling everyone within 50 emirs about how you showed up, those fancy engineers. Stories already reached Columbus, and I expect we'll see some real reporters tomorrow. The prospect of media attention carrying implications about privacy and family security that Shaw had hoped to avoid. His military background included classified work that required maintaining low profiles even years after leaving active duty. There are reasons I prefer staying out of the spotlight, Shaw said carefully. Some of my previous work involved sensitive projects that are better left unexamined. Foster nodded with understanding that came from his own military experience and knowledge of how certain careers created ongoing obligations about discretion and security. Figured as much, Foster replied. Man doesn't develop your kind of expertise fixing pickup trucks and lawnmowers. Question is, what do you need from me to manage whatever comes next? The offer of support from local law enforcement reflected community bonds that had developed over years of quiet service and mutual respect, reminding Shaw that leaving Redwood meant abandoning relationships that had sustained them through difficult periods. Honestly, Chief, I'm not sure yet, Shaw admitted. The consulting offer from Thornton represents opportunities I can't provide for Mia any other way, but it also means accepting responsibilities I've spent 15 years trying to avoid. Alejandro had been listening with growing appreciation for the complexity of decisions his boss faced, understanding that today's triumph had created dilemmas rather than simple solutions. Boss, whatever you decide, you've got people here who support you, Alejandro said firmly. This community's benefited from your skills for years, even if we didn't understand their full scope. You don't owe anyone explanations about choices that affect your family's future. Mia looked between the assembled men, recognizing that her father's decision would determine not only their economic circumstances, but also the kind of life they would build together. Dad, I know how much you've sacrificed for my future, she said thoughtfully. But I also know that you've been happiest when you're solving problems that help people. Maybe this consulting work is a chance to do both. The observation demonstrated perceptiveness that reminded Shaw painfully of her mother, who had possessed similar ability to see through complex situations to fundamental truths about values and priorities. Mia's right about your motivation, Chief Foster added. 15 years I've watched you work, and you've never been able to walk away from people who needed help. Those German engineers need your expertise to prevent equipment failures that it could hurt innocent people. Shaw studied the technical documentation spread across his kitchen table, seeing not just engineering problems, but human consequences that his knowledge could prevent. The moral weight of expertise carried obligations that transcended personal preferences about privacy and simple living. Outside Redwood settled into evening routines that had characterized their lives for 15 years, providing stability and community connections that big city consulting work would force them to abandon. But beneath the comfortable familiarity lay recognition that some opportunities carried responsibilities that couldn't be ignored, regardless of personal cost. Shaw gathered the technical files with deliberate precision, understanding that tomorrow would bring decisions that would fundamentally alter everything they had built together in their small Ohio town. Morning arrived with the kind of clarity that follows difficult decisions made in the quiet hours before dawn. Shaw had spent most of the night reviewing technical documentation and weighing obligations that extended far beyond personal preferences, finally reaching conclusions that balanced family needs against moral responsibilities in ways that honored both. At 7:30, he called Harrison Thornton's office to arrange a meeting that would determine the direction of their lives for years to come. The plant owner's immediate availability suggested that Sean's decision carried implications for Thornton Manufacturing that went beyond simple consulting arrangements. Mia appeared in the kitchen as Shaw finished his coffee, dressed for school, but clearly hoping to learn about her father's conclusions before beginning another day of managing classmates. Questions about yesterday's extraordinary events. Did you decide about the consulting offer? She asked directly, settling into the chair across from him with the focused attention she brought to important discussions. Shaw studied his daughter's face, seeing intelligence and maturity that reminded him why every sacrifice had been worthwhile, while recognizing that his decision would fundamentally shape her future opportunities. I'm going to accept a modified version of Thornton's proposal, Shaw said carefully, but with conditions that allow us to stay in Redwood while I work on solving the design problems. Mia's expression shifted through surprise, relief, and curiosity as she processed implications that differed from the either-or choice she had anticipated. How does that work? Modern engineering collaboration doesn't require physical relocation, Shaw explained. I can review designs, develop solutions, and coordinate with the German team through digital communication while maintaining our life. Here, Thornton gets the expertise he needs. We get the financial security for your education, and our community keeps whatever benefits my presence provides. The solution demonstrated the systematic problem-solving approach that had characterized Shaw's entire performance, finding ways to satisfy multiple requirements simultaneously Rather than accepting false limitations about available options, Alejandro arrived early for work, entering through the apartment's private entrance with coffee and the morning newspaper that featured a front-page story about yesterday's events at Thornton Manufacturing. Boss, you made the regional news, Alejandro announced, spreading the paper across the kitchen table. Listen to this headline. Local mechanic solves engineering problem that stumped European specialists. Shaw scanned the article with mixed feelings about public attention that would make maintaining low profiles increasingly difficult, while appreciating that accurate reporting might benefit other working people who faced similar dismissive attitudes from employers. Article's pretty fair, Shaw observed, focuses on the technical achievement rather than sensationalizing the class conflict aspects. Josep's already got 3 copies framed for the diner. Alejandro added with obvious pride. Says it's the best advertising the working community has gotten in decades. At 8:15, Shaw walked to Thornton Manufacturing for the meeting that would finalize consulting arrangements while establishing precedents about respect and compensation for expertise regardless of its source. The morning felt different from yesterday's confrontational atmosphere, carrying recognition that mutual benefit required acknowledging capabilities rather than dismissing them. Harrison Thornton met him in the executive conference room, accompanied by Dr. Rossi and Klaus Weber, who had remained overnight to coordinate with German headquarters about the scope of required design revisions. Mr. Reilly, Thornton began. Formally, I trust you've had time to consider our proposal and the technical challenges we've discussed. Shaw settled into the offered chair with the confidence that came from having thoroughly analyzed both engineering problems and business implications. I'm prepared to accept consulting responsibilities for correcting the design flaws, but with specific conditions about work arrangements and compensation. Structure. Dr. Rossi leaned forward with obvious interest in Shaw's terms, recognizing that his expertise was essential to preventing equipment failures that could affect millions of people worldwide. What conditions? Thornton asked, his tone suggesting willingness to accommodate reasonable requirements rather than imposing arbitrary limitations. Shaw produced a handwritten outline that organized his requirements according to priorities that reflected family values, professional standards, and community obligations. First, I work from Redwood with periodic travel to Germany for hands-on collaboration. Shaw began. My daughter's education and our community connections take precedence over corporate convenience. Klaus Weber nodded approvingly, understanding that effective engineering required stable working conditions rather than constant disruption. Remote collaboration is standard practice for international projects. We have excellent digital communication systems. Second, compensation includes immediate establishment of an educational fund for Mia's college expenses, with additional provisions for other local students who demonstrate engineering aptitude. Shaw continued. The requirement reflected values about community investment that extended beyond personal advancement, ensuring that Shaw's success would benefit other young people facing similar economic barriers to higher education. Third, I maintain ownership of my auto repair business and continue serving local customers. Shaw added. The consulting work supplements rather than replaces my existing commitments to this community. Thornton considered the terms with growing appreciation for their reasonableness, recognizing that Shaw's requirements addressed legitimate needs rather than attempting to exploit his negotiating position. Those conditions are acceptable, Thornton agreed. The technical problems you've identified require immediate attention regardless of work arrangements. Dr. Rossi consulted preliminary reports that Klaus Weber had prepared for transmission to German headquarters. Mr. Reilly, our analysis confirms that your bearing stress calculations are correct. We need comprehensive design revisions for the entire engine family. Shaw accepted the technical documentation that would guide months of detailed engineering work, understanding that his involvement would prevent equipment failures while advancing knowledge that benefited everyone who depended on reliable mechanical systems. The fundamental design principles are sound, Shaw explained. We need to modify combustion chamber geometry and revise bearing specifications to handle the actual stress patterns rather than theoretical calculations. Klaus Weber activated his laptop to display preliminary revision concepts that incorporated Shaw's recommendations about harmonic resonance and bearing stress distribution. We've begun implementing your exhaust modifications across all engine variants. Initial testing shows dramatic improvement in performance stability. The rapid adoption of Shaw's solutions demonstrated professional recognition that transcended national boundaries or educational credentials, validating his belief that expertise should be measured by results rather than social status. Outside the conference room, word was spreading through Thornton Manufacturing that the local mechanic who had solved their engineering crisis was being hired as a senior consulting engineer. The news carried implications about respect and opportunity that would influence workplace relationships for years to come. At Redwood, high school Mia sat through morning classes while processing the knowledge that her father's success had secured her educational future, without requiring them to abandon the community that had supported their family through difficult times. During lunch period, she called her father from the school office to confirm that their modified life plan would indeed allow her to finish high school in Redwood while preparing for engineering studies that his consulting income would make possible. "Dad, are you sure this arrangement will work?" Mia asked. "It sounds almost too good to be true." "It works because everyone benefits," Shaw replied from his auto shop where he was maintaining normal operations while beginning his new responsibilities. "Thornton gets the expertise he needs. The German company prevents equipment failures. We get financial security, and our community sees that local talent deserves respect and opportunity." The solution embodied principles about mutual benefit and shared success that challenged traditional assumptions about zero-sum competition between different social classes. Joseph's Diner had become an unofficial celebration headquarters where townspeople gathered to discuss implications of Shaw's achievement that extended beyond individual success to broader questions about recognizing capabilities in unexpected places. Ruby McKenna held court at her usual corner booth, no longer worried about Shaw's recklessness, but proud of his vindication of working class intelligence and determination. "Always knew that boy had more sense than people gave him credit for," Ruby declared to anyone willing to listen. "Took some fancy foreign engineers to prove what we should have recognized years ago." Pastor Charles Bell moved between tables, observing with satisfaction how Shaw's success had strengthened community bonds while challenging prejudices that had divided people based on economic circumstances rather than character and capability. "This is what happens when we judge people by their actions rather than their bank accounts," Pastor Bell told Frank Morrison, the barber who had been among Sean's earliest supporters. By late afternoon, Shaw had completed his first formal engineering report as a consultant for Thornton Manufacturing, documenting design modifications that would prevent bearing failures while improving overall engine efficiency. The work felt familiar, despite 15 years away from formal engineering practice, confirming that expertise like integrity didn't diminish with time. Alejandro had spent the day managing increased traffic at the auto shop as customers and curiosity seekers arrived to congratulate Shaw, while hoping to witness whatever magic had impressed European specialists. "Boss, we had more people through here today than in the last 3 months combined," Alejandro reported as evening approached. "Everyone wants to shake hands with the guy who showed up, Harrison Thornton." Sean smiled while organizing tools that would serve double duty for both automotive repair and international engineering consultation. "Alec's success has been a team effort. None of this would have happened without your support and the community's faith in our work." As darkness settled over Redwood, Shaw stood outside his shop, looking toward the manufacturing plant where lights indicated continued activity around projects that would benefit from his expertise. While providing security for his family's future, Too Betty had accepted to defend his dignity had evolved into opportunities that honored both his capabilities and his values, proving that respect and success were possible without abandoning principles or community connections. Mia joined him on the sidewalk, carrying acceptance letters from engineering schools that had arrived in the day's mail, along with scholarship information that made her educational dreams achievable. "Dad, everything's going to be different now," she observed, studying the familiar downtown streets that would remain their home, while her father's work extended across international boundaries. "Different circumstances, same values," Shaw replied, putting his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "We'll use these opportunities to build something better while staying connected to the people and principles that brought us this far." The transformation had proven that expertise transcended social boundaries, that respect should be based on capability, rather than economic status, and that the most profound changes often began with individuals willing to stand up for their dignity and the dignity of everyone around them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities. But tonight, Redwood celebrated the vindication of values that had sustained their community through difficult times, while opening doors to futures that seemed impossible. Just days earlier, Shaw had won far more than a simple bet. He had proven that worth couldn't be measured by bank accounts or job titles, that intelligence flourished in unexpected places, and that the courage to challenge assumptions could change everything for the better. The story would be told for years to come, inspiring other working people to recognize their own capabilities while demanding the respect that expertise, wherever it originated, rightfully deserved. The end up next too. More incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a